If you grew up before the internet, you remember a world that moved slower, a world filled with small silences, the kind that came between turning the pages of a magazine, or waiting for the phone to ring, or walking to the corner store just to see what was new. Back then, life wasn't instant. You had to wait for things, and sometimes that waiting was half the magic. Join me as we take a trip back to the analog age, a time before screens, before scrolling, and before notifications decided what mattered most. There was a different kind of noise back then, not the endless hum of devices or the ping of incoming messages, but the low buzz of a refrigerator, the ticking of a wall clock, or the static between radio stations. If you were lucky, you might catch your favorite song by chance on the radio, and you'd rush to press record on your cassette deck, hoping no one would talk over it. That was our version of downloading. We didn't refresh feeds, we rewound tapes, we didn't double tap, and we flipped vinyl records. And when we wanted to know what was happening in the world, we didn't open a browser. We opened a newspaper. Mornings started with the smell of coffee, the crinkle of the daily paper, and maybe the sound of a typewriter tapping in a distant room. If you needed to look something up, you didn't search it, you researched it. That meant flipping through the pages of an encyclopedia that probably still smelled like the 1970s. The newspaper brought you the world, but just once a day. If something important happened after that, you wouldn't know until tomorrow. And somehow, that was fine. The TV news came on at 6 and you planned your evening around it. Anchors spoke slowly, and their words felt weighty. You trusted them. There was no scroll bar to skip ahead, no autoplay next story fast. When they spoke, you listened. There was no instant messaging, just messages. If someone called and you weren't home, they'd leave a note with your mum, or maybe a message on an answering machine, if you were fancy enough to have one. People accepted that you weren't always reachable. In fact, being unreachable was normal. When you wanted to talk, you had to plan for it. You'd call a friend and say, "Let's meet at the diner after work," and that was that. No confirmations, no GPS tracking, no last-minute texts. And when you showed up, they were there. Because back then, plans meant something. Waiting wasn't wasted time. It was part of life. We waited for film to be developed, for mail to arrive, for songs to come on the radio, for a reply to a letter written in your best handwriting. You'd walk to the mailbox with a kind of quiet excitement, and when you saw that familiar envelope with your name written on it, it felt like the world was smaller and kinder. There was a rhythm to life that gave everything its own moment. Even boredom had a texture, a kind of fertile quiet that made you daydream, build things, or just sit and think. Today we call it disconnection. Back then, it was simply life. The analog world was made of things you could touch, photographs, cassette tapes, books and letters that carried the warmth of the person who sent them. You could feel the texture of a postcard, smell the ink of a newly printed magazine, or hear the soft crackle of a vinyl record starting to spin. There was something grounding about it, a constant reminder that experience was physical, not virtual. Even the flaws were beautiful. The scratch on your favorite record, the static in a radio broadcast, the faint blur in an old photograph. They reminded you that what you were experiencing was real. Without the internet to fill every idle second, time itself felt different. There was space in the day, space to think, to be curious, to get lost in thought. Moments weren't documented, they were simply lived. When you saw something beautiful, you didn't take out a phone, you just looked. You took a mental picture, and you carried it with you. And that's the strange thing about memory. The fewer photos we took, the more we remembered. Maybe that S because we were in the moment, not just watching it through a lens. The world before the internet wasn't better or worse, just different. It was quieter, slower, and perhaps a little more human. But that's just the beginning of our journey. Before the internet, the rhythm of life followed the pulse of the day itself. Sunrise to sunset, week to weekend. If you wanted to know what was happening, you didn't reach for a glowing screen. You listened, watched, or read. There was no constant stream of information. The world didn't come to you. You went out to meet it. In the analog world, mornings began with sound. The hiss of a coffee pot, the thump of the newspaper landing on the porch, the clatter of shoes on a wooden floor. You might switch on the radio, and hear the day's weather from a familiar voice, or unfold the paper to see what had happened while you were asleep. That paper was more than news. It was a ritual. Each page had a smell of ink and possibility. You'd fold it under your arm on the way to work, maybe saving the comics or crossword for lunch. Phones were anchored to the wall. They didn't travel with you. They waited at home, patient and silent, until you returned. And when you left for the day, you were gone. No notifications followed you. Your thoughts were your own. When you didn't know something, you couldn't just Google it. You had to find someone who did, or find it yourself. That meant libraries with their quiet air and rows of card catalogues. It meant encyclopedias that took up an entire bookshelf. It meant curiosity that took effort. If you wanted to learn how to fix your car, you found a manual or asked your neighbor. If you wanted to understand a new topic, you went to the library and looked it up. Maybe in microfilm, squinting under the glow of a tiny screen that hummed softly as you turned the reel. Research was slow, but it had weight. When you found an answer, it mattered, because you had worked for it. The telephone was a kind of lifeline, but it was also an event. When it rang, everyone turned to listen. If you missed the call, that was that. There were no texts, no follow-ups, no apologies for not seeing your message. Letters, though, letters were special. You could tell who wrote them just by their handwriting, the slope of their words, the way the paper folded. Sometimes the envelope carried the faint smell of perfume or a smudge of ink where the pen hesitated. You'd keep those letters in a box tied with a ribbon, long after the sender had moved away. They were proof that someone, somewhere, had stopped their day just to think of you. At work, desks were cluttered with pens, staplers, notepads, and telephones with coiled cords that tangled no matter how carefully you placed them. If you wanted to copy something, you used carbon paper or the brand new marvel of the office, the Xerox machine. Meetings happened face to face. Memos were typed, signed, and hand-delivered. There were no reply all mistakes, only the occasional paper jam or coffee stain. And when you left the office, work stayed behind. There were no after-hours emails, no endless notifications. The weekend was truly a weekend. Without online shopping, every errand was an experience. If you needed something, you went out into the world. You'd walk into a store, talk to someone behind the counter, maybe get advice or a recommendation. Stores were social places, not just rows of products, but hubs of conversation. You might see your neighbor in the aisle, or bump into a friend while waiting in line. Even buying a record or a roll of film could turn into a small adventure. There was anticipation in shopping. You couldn't get everything instantly, so when something finally arrived, and a new camera, a book you ordered, a pair of shoes you'd saved for, it meant something. It was a small victory over time itself. Without endless entertainment on demand, you had to make your own fun. Kids rode their bikes until dark, built forts, climbed trees, and came home with scraped knees and wild stories. Adults read books, played board games, fixed things in the garage, or gathered around the television when a favorite show was on. You didn't binge-watch, you waited all week for the next episode. And when it came on, everyone was watching together. A whole neighborhood tuned to the same moment. The living room was the heart of the home, and the TV was the hearth. Families would sit down together after dinner, maybe watch the evening news, or an episode of The Twilight Zone or The Carol Burnett Show. Then when the national anthem played and the screen went dark, that was it. The day was over. It wasn't a perfect world, far from it. But there was a balance to things because you couldn't do everything at once. You did what you could, one thing at a time. When you cooked, you cooked. When you read, you read. When you talked, you looked someone in the eye. And maybe that's what we miss most about those analog days. The feeling of being fully present. Every action, every moment had your full attention. Before the internet, connection didn't happen through screens. It happened through moments, real, tangible, imperfect moments, the kind that filled a room with laughter or left a silence that meant more than words ever could. When people wanted company, they didn't log in, they showed up. You'd knock on a neighbor's door, stop by a friend's house, or run into someone downtown. If you were lucky, they'd invite you in for coffee or maybe a slice of pie that had just come out of the oven. Conversations stretched longer back then. Nobody was rushing to check notifications. The only thing glowing in the room was the lamp on the table. Friday nights were special. For many, it was movie night. You'd pick a film at the video rental store, or before that you'd simply tune in to whatever was playing on TV. Sometimes the movie you wanted wasn't available, so you'd try something new. That's how you discovered hidden gems or classics you never planned to watch. There was a certain charm in the limitation itself. Music was another kind of magic. Before streaming, songs lived on records, cassettes, and radio waves. You could hold your music in your hands, read the album notes, study the artwork, and memorize every lyric. When a new record came out, it wasn't background noise. It was an event. You'd sit down, lower the needle, and listen from start to finish because skipping tracks meant getting up and moving the arm. Every scratch on that vinyl told its own story, where you dropped it, who borrowed it, or the night it skipped on your favorite song. Those imperfections became part of the experience, and when you shared music with friends, it wasn't through a link. It was through a mixtape. Hours spent recording, labeling, decorating, just to hand someone a little piece of your heart. Television, too, carried its own ritual. Families gathered around the set after dinner, adjusting the antenna just right to clear the static. The programs were simple: sitcoms, news, variety shows. But they created shared memories. When something big happened, the whole country saw it at the same time. The moon landing, the final episode of MASH. The world paused together. There was something comforting about knowing that millions of people were watching the same thing you were, at the exact same moment. It made the world feel smaller and somehow more connected, even without the internet. Social life thrived in the physical world. Teenagers met at diners, drive-ins, or roller rinks. Couples went dancing. Families visited friends unannounced, and that was perfectly fine. You didn't text before you arrived, you just knocked, smiled, and stepped inside. Every gathering had a soundtrack. Laughter, clinking glasses, maybe a record spinning softly in the corner. When people took photos, it was an act of trust. You couldn't see the result right away, so you'd wait days, sometimes weeks, for your film to be developed. Each picture was a surprise, some blurry, some perfect, some ruined by the flash, but every one of them was real. You didn't delete memories. You kept them in boxes, albums, or frames that sat on mantels for years. We often forget how precious those small rituals were. The act of waiting, the patience, the shared anticipation. Even boredom had meaning. It gave birth to creativity. Kids who had nothing to do ended up building forts, drawing comics, writing stories, or just lying on the grass and staring at clouds, trying to find shapes in the sky. Adults too had their escapes. They tinkered in garages, built model planes, collected stamps, worked on cars, or tended to gardens that bloomed because of care, not convenience. When you fixed something, it wasn't a matter of click and replace, and it was patience, persistence, and pride. There was beauty in making things last. And when night fell, the world grew quiet in a way that's hard to imagine now. Streets emptied, stores closed, and the glow of neon signs faded into the dark. The only light came from living rooms, soft, golden, and still. You could almost hear the sound of families winding down. A parent reading in an armchair, a record playing low, a child brushing their teeth before bed. Outside, the sky was vast and unbroken by city glare. You could see the stars and sometimes the Milky Way itself. It was a different kind of connection, not through cables or satellites, but through the simple wonder of looking up and realizing how small and miraculous everything really was. Looking back, it's not that the analog world was better. It was just slower, quieter, and more deliberate. It required patience, and that patience shaped us. We learned to wait, to focus, to appreciate the moment we were in, because we had no choice but to be there. The analog world taught us how to be present, and maybe, just maybe, that's the one lesson we've lost in our rush toward the digital future. The internet didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, through the soft glow of a computer screen, the crackle of a dial-up tone, and the first tentative emails that replaced handwritten letters. At first, it was a novelty. You could send a message across the world in seconds. You could look up anything you wanted, any time you wanted. The future had arrived, and it fit neatly on your desk. But little by little, the analog world began to fade. The phone stopped ringing as often. The mailbox felt emptier. The camera rolls at the corner store started to disappear. One by one, the rituals that had given shape to our days slipped quietly into memory. We traded patience for speed and distance for convenience. The wait was over, and with it, something else went missing too. It's strange how progress can feel both miraculous and melancholy. We gained the world at our fingertips, but we lost the feeling of reaching out to touch it. The hum of the modem replaced the hum of the radio. The warmth of a letter became a blinking cursor on a screen. And somewhere between downloading and uploading, between logging in and logging out, we forgot what it felt like to simply be. The analog world asked us to slow down. It taught us to live within the boundaries of time, to understand that some things take longer, and that was okay. It wasn't designed for multitasking, it was built for presence. When you sat down to listen to a record, that's all you did. You weren't checking your phone, answering emails, or watching another screen. You just listened. Every note, every crackle, every word, it was all part of the experience. When you developed a photo, you didn't take 50 shots to get one right. You took one, maybe two, and you hoped for the best. And because of that, you remembered the moment more vividly. You were there when it happened, even conversations felt deeper. You couldn't text someone while talking to someone else. You had to choose, and in choosing you gave them your full attention. Maybe that's what made connections stronger back then. Not because they were easier, but because they required effort. You had to show up. The analog world demanded intention. You couldn't scroll through people. You met them. You couldn't swipe away boredom. You faced it. You couldn't filter your life. You lived it, messy edges and all. And yet, despite all that we've lost, the traces of that world are still with us. They live in the way an old song can stop us in our tracks, or how a printed photograph can still bring tears to our eyes. They're in the weight of a book, the smell of paper, the click of a cassette case, the flicker of film. These things remind us of a time when the world felt larger and smaller at once, vast in mystery, yet intimate in connection. There is a kind of peace in remembering that life doesn't have to be instant to be meaningful, that sometimes the beauty of a moment lies in the time it takes to unfold. So maybe the lesson isn't about going back, but about remembering what it meant to move slowly, to write something by hand, to wait for a knock on the door, to look up at the night sky and see the stars, not through a photo on a feed, but with your own eyes. The internet connected us in ways the analog world never could, but it also disconnected us from the quiet, from the patience, from the texture of life itself. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, we can still hear the faint echo of that analog rhythm. The turning of a record, the click of a camera, the sound of footsteps on a quiet street at dusk. A reminder that beneath all the noise of the digital age, there's still a heartbeat that moves slower and deeper. Because in the end, the analog world wasn't just about technology, it was about how we felt time. And maybe, just maybe, that's something worth remembering. So tonight, when you put your phone down, let the silence settle for a while. Listen to it. That's the sound of the world we once knew, the world before the internet, when everything was slower, quieter, and a little more human. If you enjoyed this trip back in time, I bet you'll like the next one too. Just click to watch him and I'll meet you there somewhere between memory and history.